Hello, my name is Lily, and today I will be presenting on my research entitled Testing the Correlation Between CRP Albumin Ratios in Pre-CAR T-cell Infusion lymphoma patients with CRS and ICANS max scores. So the key word here is lymphoma patients, meaning I focused on cancer research. Whether it's from a family member, friend, neighbor, or personal experience, we all know that cancer is one of the most plaguing conditions of the 21st century. And that's why it's important to find treatment options that are both safe and effective. And that brings us to CAR T cell therapy. CAR T cell therapy, standing for chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy, is where patients' own immune cells, or T cells, are edited, multiplied, and reinfused into the body. How it works is these specific immune cells are fitted with chimeric antigen receptors, known as CARs. They're fitted to these cells, and these receptors bind, as shown in the image above, to the surface antigens of cancer cells in a lock and key like fashion. When the antigens bind to the CARs, uh, enzymatic signals such as perforin and Gren enzyme are released, and that induces programmed cell death known as apoptosis of the cancer cell, making this treatment very effective and mitigating side effects in general, such as rejection of the body to a foreign substance, as the patient's own immune cells are what's being used. However novel, there are adverse events that do come with CAR T cell therapy, the two most prominent being CRS and ICANS. CRS stands for cytokine release syndrome, while ICANS stands for immune effector cell associated neurotoxicity syndrome. Although similar, as shown in the image below, they both stem from cytokine release, or an overreaction of the immune system, where inflammatory cytokines inflame the body and thus cause different grades of these events. What differentiates ICANS from CRS is the keyword neurotoxicity. These cytokines cross the blood-brain barrier and thus inflame the brain. CRS and ICANS are graded on a universal scale stemming from 0 to 5. In this case, 0 represents not having the conditions at all, while 5 can be organ failure and severe cases death. Grades 3 to 5 are considered high, and thus anything under 3 is considered a low or fairly low grade. But what if there is a way to predict the severity of these grades in the future? That is where biomarkers such as the CRP albumin ratio, abbreviated to CAR, come into play. CAR is a division of the C-reactive protein, which is an inflammation marker found in the liver, and that's divided by the albumin protein, which signals nutritional status and is found in the bloodstream. The two, CRP over albumin, create a specific ratio. And in this case, the greater the ratio, the lesser prognosis, as typically in patients, we would see an elevation of C-reactive protein, or an increase in inflammation. Well, there would also be a simultaneous decrease in nutritional status as patients are fighting immune disease. There have been a variety of previous research studies to support CAR itself. Firstly, adverse events from CAR T cell therapy, CRS and ICANS, were tested in CAR T infused lymphoma patients, and they found that CRS was consistent across all subgroups, while ICANS was the second most prominent, leading us to use these two conditions to test for the predictive power of CAR. The second article used the Essex score, which measures endothelial cell activation in stem cell transplants. And that actually is not the same as the CAR or the CRP albumin ratio. However, it does combine two inflammatory biomarkers, CRP and ferritin. And the goal of this was to test the association between the Essex score and ICANS and CRS in lymphoma patients. And they found that CRP can correlate with CAR T toxicities, which is a big portion of the ratio. The last article wanted to test CAR as a predictor of adverse events in lymphoma patients, minus the CAR T portion. And they found that CAR was elevated in a trend where albumin levels were lower for metastatic disease groups and CRP in the blood was elevated for all. But that brings us to an evident problem, that there is a lack of studies evaluating CAR as a predictor of severe, and in this case, grades greater than 3, and overall grades of ICANS and CRS in CAR T cancer populations. That's why the first goal here was to evaluate the correlation overall between CAR and ICANS and CRS severity scores, using the Spearman's row and associated p-values for significance. The second goal was more specific, to create patient risk groups with binarized scores for a threshold to test for a threshold link to CAR. A lot of these biomarkers only become statistically relevant after a defined threshold, and in this case, high and low grades, which I will go more into in the methodology. The first hypothesis correlating to the first goal was that higher pretreatment CAR levels will be associated with higher grades of CRS and ICANS in CAR T lymphoma patients. The second hypothesis was that patients with higher pretreatment CAR values are more likely to experience defined threshold grades of ICANS and CRS. Bringing us to the methodology, I worked remotely analyzing a dataset provided by my mentor, who also assisted in creating the hypotheses and guiding me, the student, in organizing and analyzing the data. My role was to develop and create such hypotheses and also to clean and organize the data. However, what made this research a little bit different is that we used an adaptive testing model, or essentially we based future statistical tests and the need for those tests off of previous results. So essentially taking what we found in the first statistical test and applying it to decide which statistical test comes next. And then I, as a student, also analyzed outcomes. There was very few, again, equipment and materials as I worked remotely, utilizing a de-identified and private patient data set to protect identity. And also all analysis were performed using online platforms such as Microsoft Excel, Google, and Google Collaboratory using a coding language known as Python 3.0. Bringing us to the methodology, it's important to note that the cohort was relatively small, consisting of only 287 patients, which is relatively small in terms of clinical trials overall. It's also important to note that there was more CRS cases than ICANS, although there was fewer high-grade cases of CRS than there were of ICANS. In this comparison, it is 17 to 34, which is still quite small overall. Patients with missing data were discounted from all analysis, naturally. It's also lastly important to note that the grade 5 cases, or the most severe cases, were next to none or very few in this data set. For CRS, there was only 4 out of the 266 with recorded grades and 272 for ICANS, which definitely compounds the likelihood of getting outliers and having those outliers skew data, as we will see in the results. Lastly, in the methodology, we used, again, this adapting testing model. We started by conducting the Spearman's rank, which tests for the general correlation between how if patient CAR levels or CRP albumin levels will be elevated in relation to higher grades of ICANS and CRS, and p-values were also yielded for significance. The next thing we decided to do was binarize data into, or these max scores for both ICANS and CRS into high and low grades, as defined by the set standard of medicine and health. Grades 3 and greater were binarized as 1 or high, and anything less than 3 was binarized as 0. Using these binarized grades, I ran a logistic regression, which was ran to determine the association between the odds of getting high grades and CAR, essentially testing for an odds ratio, or the odds of getting a severe grade by every 1 unit increase of CAR, as we will see in the results. For graphs and visuals, I created scatter plots of the binary outcomes and predictive curves for probability, which help visually show and graphically represent data. Bringing us to the results of the ICANS and CRS Spearman's test, we found that for both adverse events, the Spearman's rank test was insignificant, and those p-values correlate as they are higher than 0.05. The next thing I ran was the binary log regression. We found that logistic regression was, although insignificant for ICANS with an odds ratio of only 1.23 around, the CRS logistic regression results were significant as the odds ratio was around 48% or 1.48% around, meaning for every 1 unit increase in CRP, there was a 48% increase in the odds of getting a high-grade CRS case. And the p-values correlate respectively for CRS and ICANS, indicating significance. Similarly yielded from the logistic regression were predictive probability curves, such as for CRS and ICANS. There were these slopes indicated by CRP albumin on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the predicted probability. For the CRS curve, there's an evidently sharper slope, and that shows that increased odds ratio and also slope from the regression. And ICANS, in turn, shows that flatter slope or more insignificant results. However, here's where things get a little tricky. In the raw patient data scatters, we have on the x-axis CRP albumin ratios again, and on the y-axis we have CRS outcomes, binary, and the ICANS outcomes, which are also binary, 0 and 1. For both ICANS and CRS, there's a pattern of clumping along lower CAR values for both high and lower, zeros and ones. However, we would expect for CRS there to be the ones to be clumped along higher ratios of CRP albumin. And that actually disagrees with the regression results, meaning the regression results were most likely due to outliers. Last thing is the discussion. For ICANS overall, the Spearman and logistic regression and p-values were all insignificant, showing a disassociation with CAR, meaning hypothesis 1 and 2 were refuted for ICANS. For CRS, Spearman's was insignificant, but at a set threshold of binarization, high odds ratio were associated with high grades of CRS, and the probability curve and p-values reflect this correlation. However, the raw scatter disagrees, and because of the evident pattern of clumping along lower grades. So hypothesis 1 was refuted, and hypothesis 2 was technically supported for CRS, although it was most likely supported due to the presence of outliers, as we found in the visuals. There thus needs to be future testing in order to confirm this correlation. If it's supported and CAR is confirmed in its predictive power in the future, it can be used as an indicator of lymphoma cancer patient prognosis and aid in early intervention and preventative care. If this is refuted in the future, we can explore the predictive power of other inflammatory biomarkers, such as ferritin in the Essex score, TNF alpha or tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interleukin 6, which often works in relation to TNF alpha, and are all inflammation biomarkers. In the future, we want to repeat this with a much larger patient cohort size, as this cohort only contained 287 patients. Additionally, with a higher incidence of severity, meaning greater percentages of grade 5 cases for both ICANS and CRS. Also, we could repeat this with a variety of different cancer types, as this study only focused on lymphoma, but there is hundreds of other cancer subtypes and subtypes of lymphoma, which in this case, the study did contain many or almost all of the different subtypes of lymphoma, but we could isolate that specifically to test for each subtype, this pattern, or different cancer types entirely. And the last step would be to initiate clinical trials. Thank you for listening.